In the perilous waters of the Arctic, an explorer named Robert Walton is on a dangerous expedition to the North Pole. He is full of ambition and wants to make a great discovery for the benefit of science and mankind. But one day, as his ship is stranded between sheets of ice, Walton and his crew spot something strange, a giant figure traveling across the ice on a sled. The next morning they find yet another sled drifting nearby, this time carrying a half-frozen man who is on the brink of death. Bringing him aboard, Walton nurses him back to health and learns his name, Victor Frankenstein. Over time, Frankenstein recovers, but it is clear that he is a broken man suffering with enormous grief and guilt. He decides to share his story with Walton, explaining that he began his life as the son of a wealthy family who cared for him deeply. He was especially close to his adopted sister, Elizabeth, who grew up with him from a young age, with the intention that they would marry later on. Sadly, his mother died when he was 17, giving him his first taste of loss and tragedy. As a child, Victor became fascinated with science, particularly the works of debunked alchemists who were looking to unlock the secrets of life and the universe. At university, he was introduced to modern science and began to merge their ideas together, becoming obsessed with discovering the key to creating life. His studies soon took a dark turn, as he began to secretly experiment with body parts and worked night and day to awaken his twisted creation. After months of work, his experiment succeeded at last, and the form he had assembled opened its eyes. But instead of joy, Victor was immediately filled with horror and regret. The being he had given life was not the magnificent figure he had imagined, but a grotesque, unnatural creature who filled him with dread. Terrified, Victor fled his laboratory and wandered the streets until he came across his childhood friend, Henry Clerval, who had come to check up on him. Luckily, the creature had left his apartment by the time they returned, but the ordeal led to a complete breakdown, as he was unable to confess the terrible thing that he had done. After a long recovery, Victor slowly begins to feel like the nightmare is over and that he can return to some kind of normalcy. But he couldn't have been more wrong. A letter arrives from his father, bringing devastating news. His younger brother William has been murdered, and even worse, the family's loyal servant Justine had been accused of committing the crime, as they found his locket in her belongings. But Victor soon learns the real truth when he catches a glimpse of the towering figure moving through the woods near the site of the murder. The creature he had brought to life was the one who had strangled his brother. Despite knowing this, Victor did nothing to defend Justine, believing that people would dismiss his claims as the ravings of a madman. The innocent woman was hanged, and Victor was left with the weight of 2 deaths on his conscience. Racked with grief, Victor fled to the mountains to be alone, but to his horror, he came face to face with his creature, who begged him to listen to his story. He explained that after being abandoned, he had been rejected by every human he came across and struggled in the wilderness until he finally found shelter near a small cottage, where he secretly observed the family who lived there. By watching them, he learned to speak and read, and slowly began to understand human emotions, relationships, and kindness. After more than a year, he finally gathered the courage to reveal himself to the family, but was chased away in fear and disgust at his physical appearance. Heartbroken and furious, the creature realized that no matter how much he tried to be good, humans would always see him as a monster because of his outward appearance, and so he set out to find his creator and make him suffer how he had suffered. In Geneva, he came across Victor's brother, who reacted in the same terrified, disgusted way. This triggered him, and he strangled him to death, taking his locket and placing it in the sleeping Justine's clothes to frame her for the murder. Now that Victor was caught up on his life story, the creature demanded that he make a companion for him so that he would not be alone in the world. If he did so, he promised to leave society forever and never harm another human again. Shaken by his story and full of guilt, Victor agreed to the creature's request. But the task proved more difficult than anticipated, as he could not bring himself to make another creature that he despised so much. Under the pretense of continuing his scientific studies, he left for England with his friend Henry Clerval, and after months of traveling, came across a remote Scottish island where he resolved to finish his gruesome task. Now that he was alone and close to completing his work, however, he began to think twice about his promise and the possible repercussions of what he was doing for the future of humanity. In a fateful moment, he made his decision and tore the lifeless figure limb from limb. But as he did so, he heard a rage-filled howl outside. The creature had been watching his progress, and seeing his one hope of companionship destroyed, he now confronted Victor furiously. He vowed to take revenge on him for what he had done, and ominously promised to be with him on his wedding night. These threats were not empty either, as the very next day, Victor was arrested for the murder of his closest friend Henry, who was strangled in the same way as his brother. Weak with illness and guilt, he spent months suffering in prison until his father finally arrived and his name was cleared. He decided to put an end to the nightmare at last by returning home and marrying Elizabeth, regardless of what the creature had said. He hoped that he'd regain some happiness and normalcy, and if the creature did kill him, at least it would put an end to his misery. On the night of their wedding, Victor armed himself with pistols and urged Elizabeth to wait in the bedroom while he prepared for the creature to strike. But when he heard a shriek from their room, he realized in horror that it was not him the creature was after, but his new bride. By the time he reached her, it was too late. Elizabeth was dead, and his father, devastated by his losses, fell ill and died shortly after. Everyone he loved was now gone, and Victor swore to hunt the creature to the ends of the earth and destroy him. His pursuit led him around the world, and finally to the frozen Arctic, but the creature, far stronger and faster than him, was always one step ahead, leaving taunting messages and clues to ensure that he never lost his trail. Finally, in the middle of the icy wasteland, he was discovered by Walton and his crew on the brink of death. Despite the dangers to himself and the ship, Victor was still determined to pursue the creature. But after the threat of mutiny from his men, Walton made the decision to abandon his quest for glory in favor of survival. Shortly after, Victor Frankenstein died, and that night, Walton heard a sound in his cabin. To his shock, the creature he had described was standing over his body, wailing with grief and regret. He revealed that he had never wanted to be a monster, but that the world had given him no choice but to become one. Now that his creator was dead, he would build a funeral pyre in the icy wastelands and burn himself to ashes so that no trace of him would remain. The creature disappeared into the night, bringing the tragic tale of Victor Frankenstein to a bitter end.